Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in South America, so I'm really excited I get to speak here. Just to get a sense of like the room, raise your hand. Who of you is actually a mobile developer, like not manager, but actually building apps day to day? Almost everyone, it seems. Nice. And then another question is like, raise your hand again. Who of you has developed mobile apps for like 5, 6 or more years? Wow, that's like, I don't know, more than 2/3. That's great. So I think, okay, you will all be able to relate to like the stuff I'm going to talk about. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about like how iOS app development has changed. And we all remember the good old days, where we had to support a single device with, a single screen resolution. It was the iPhone, right, or 3GS, but it was the same screen. Nowadays, like, I don't even know how many devices we have to support. It's a lot. So we went from, within the last 10 years, we went from a single device to like a wide range, from like Apple Watch to Apple TV or whatever. We went from manually like downloading zip files or like use Git submodules and for easy HTTP requests, right? And now we use more sophisticated dependency managers from CocoaPods, Cartridge, or the Swift Package Manager. We went from App Store review times that are, in the beginning was like 2 weeks sometimes, right, to less than a day now, so we are able to ship a lot faster. We went from just uploading 5 screenshots to iTunes Connect to 1,000 screenshots to App Store Connect. And back then, iTunes Connect only supported screenshot upload one by one. Like you literally had to upload one screenshot by one. We went from full releases every time we ship a new app to like a combination of like slow rollouts, A/B testing. It's even integrated in App Store Connect now, so we can do a lot more sophisticated things like automatic regression detection and stuff like that. And there's so much more stuff. Like back in the days, we just had Objective-C and C++, and now we have like so many languages that like work with each other, from like JavaScript and obviously Swift and so on. And also, since many of you have built iPhone apps for a long time, raise your hand. Like, who of you like used iTunes to like install the development build on the phone? It's like, okay, like not only a third now. Like, I very much remember how your manager wanted to get the latest build on the phone. You had to use Xcode to compile your app, code sign your app, launch iTunes, use a cable, and then like open the devices screen, open your phone, drag and drop the app, wait for like a minute, get a message that says error. Like, okay. And then you Google, it's like, error. And you like, restart your Mac, and that fixes it. And now, we have test flights, we have ad hoc builds, we have third-party testing services, we have development builds that work with your personal Apple ID now. Like, our life got a lot better, I think, when it comes to those things. And even like just if you think about the regular app, back in the days, an app was kind of like standalone. It was doing its own thing. And now it's like you use all these APIs and you use SDKs, and like everything became a lot more complex. And then finally, we ship much more frequently, right? Like back in the days also, we shipped from time to time, and it was like, okay, we're going to ship 1.2 now. And nowadays, it's a lot more frequent and like this continuous delivery concept. So those are some of the changes. And so in this talk, I want to talk about a little bit about how to optimize some of these processes based on like the things that have changed in our ecosystem. And so there's this thing called 12-factor app. 12-factor app is something that backend developers use a lot when they talk about how the day-to-day life as an engineer looks like and how you work as a team. And so it's written for backend developers, and it has all these best practices on like how to do deployments, how to do tests, and all these things. And I realized that we don't have anything like this for the iOS community, because a lot of the content that we all publish and read is about the actual code, right? It's stuff about how to optimize code and how like the native Swift features you can use and so on. And those are all very, very important, but I realized there is like nothing for like how do you actually work as a team. And so everything that I talk about here is not specific to a programming language. So this can all be used in Swift, in JavaScript, in Objective-C, whatever you want to use. And so let's start with just defining dependencies. So in an ideal world, your build system, be it your local build system or a CI system, does not depend on any other dependencies that are not explicitly declared. So what does it mean? As part of your Git repo, as part of your source control, you want to define exactly what version of CocoaPods, what version of Fastlane, what version of Xcode you're using. And why? To have like reproducible, reliable builds. Like in an ideal world, you should be able to go back 6 months to like a previous build and be able to trigger it again and get the exact same result again. Well, realistically, that's not possible for iOS. And there's a few reasons for that. And one is that we don't have disposable containers. Like we always have some kind of state on our machine. And for this one, it's mostly Apple to blame because of the way macOS is licensed. So if you think about Docker, you can run Docker on macOS, but you can only run Linux on it. You cannot actually run macOS on it. So a disposable container would mean that you are able to generate a new instance on your machine that is completely isolated from the rest, and you are able to like install Xcode on demand, install CocoaPods on demand, install all other dependencies on demand, and then trigger a build, and this is fully reliable. Another reason why we cannot do all these things is because we have to deal with code signing. And so if you revoke a certificate, that means that you're not able to trigger an old build again. So basically, one rule of thumb is always be explicit about your dependencies. Next up, defining the Xcode version. Do not use the App Store to install Xcode. Like Apple provides the installation method through the App Store because it's the easiest way to like get started for beginners. But if you work in a team, make sure to be explicit about what Xcode version you use right now. And also like thinking about like backend developers, if they upgrade to, let's say, a new Ruby version for Ruby on Rails, realistically, they're going to have a pull request that upgrades the Ruby version and changes the code. And this way, everybody in the team just uses the right version. There is no such thing as, oh yeah, I have the old version, and so on. And so you can either do it manually using the Apple Developer Portal, or you can use a tool like Xcode Install, which is open source, that allows you to automate the whole thing. And then one thing I kind of wanted to push for, but is an Xcode version file. Xcode version file is a simple text file in the root of your project, which just has like a number, like 8.2, which defines what Xcode version to use. And why is it important that you use the right version of Xcode? Well, Xcode is this huge thing that comes with so many other things, with your compiler, with your distribution tools, with your code signing stuff. So it's very important that you use the same one. And so this file is basically a text file you put in a repo, and any other tool can now go ahead and pick that one up to make sure that your builds are reproducible. And then if you think about onboarding new developers, like ideally in an ideal world, all you do to onboard a new developer is to run a git clone command and then have a single script that you trigger, and that's it. And that script is responsible for downloading and installing everything on your machine. And so there's no more thing of like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do this. So let's talk about the next topic, being configuration. I think we all know that you kind of want to separate data from code. Those are two different things. And so what are some examples for iOS app development? Well, one would be something like API keys or URL endpoints or even remote feature toggles. And so you always want to have those things separate from code because those things might change depending on the deployment, if it's a development build, an ad hoc build, or an app store build. So always separate those. And the easiest way to verify if you're doing a good job with that is if you ask yourself the question, if you were to open source your repo right now, would you get into any troubles? Like, did you leak any API keys? Did you leak any confidential information? So another great example is API keys. Like sometimes you need to rotate API keys. Sometimes API keys might get compromised. So you always want to be able to like change those remotely without having to update your whole app. Another thing is A/B tests. Like in the beginning, it was mostly big companies like Facebook and Twitter that did like all these A/B tests. Nowadays, it's very easy, even for like a single developer, to like set up A/B tests and see how your app behaves in the real world. And finally, over-the-air updates. And this is also something that I really push for. It is a really powerful tool. You are now able to like remotely update things like API keys or even very trivial things. Like if your app has a phone number in it for like support, if that phone number changes, you can just do that remotely. You don't need to like update the whole app. So this is a really powerful tool that I can recommend everybody to use. When it comes to the deployment, ideally, obviously, the whole deployment is fully automated. So you don't want to manually deal with version numbers, code signing, or uploading your app by hand. And it's a bummer because like all these other software engineering technologies like backend developers, they have all these really cool things, and we on iOS, unfortunately, still lag behind. So if you now go ahead and ask your backend developer how to deploy code on the production system, they're probably going to be like, well, you know, I submit this pull request, and it gets merged, and then a few hours later, it's deployed on our 1,000 nodes across the globe, and then like half a day later, I get an email with a summary of how the deployment went. And during the deployment, we have to slow rollout, so if it like has side effects, like it increases the memory usage, the rollback is the deployment is reverted and rolled back, and I get an email with details on the memory and CPU usage on our server infrastructure. And we as iOS developers was like, yeah, that's like we don't have that, and it's kind of a bummer. And I feel like we can get there. It just still requires some work. So the deployment itself, as mentioned before, should always come from like a disposable container. This allows you to be reproducible, and it allows you to run it on your local machine as well as like on some kind of CI system. And another nice side effect is that you can deploy from any CI system, and you can also change CI systems at any time. This is another thing that I've been pushing for. Employees shouldn't necessarily have access to the production Apple ID. Like, what you should do is you can have a separate Apple ID that's just responsible for managing your production certificates and private keys, and then each developer only needs development builds, so they can use the personal Apple ID for that. Like, if you think about companies like Google or Facebook, realistically, as an iOS engineer, like you don't actually have access to like modify the, rename the YouTube app to something else. So those things should be very, very separated. And then the whole concept of release trains, I'm pretty sure most of you read about this. It's a fixed schedule. Let's say it's a Monday morning where the release train leaves, which checks out the local source code of the master branch, builds your app, code signs it, and deploys it. And the great thing about release trains, if they leave every 2 weeks, is that you deploy more often, and therefore it's not a big change on each deployment, so things become more robust, and you don't have to obviously waste time on each release train. And basically every major iOS app company does that nowadays, and nowadays it's become a lot easier, so even as a smaller team, you can actually set up something like this. So very briefly, I want to talk about app versioning, because I saw there's some confusion sometimes on some teams. App versioning itself is a solved problem, and I encourage everyone to never have to actually modify the app version manually directly. We had some really funny pull requests on Fastlane, where it's like adding a feature to Fastlane, and yeah, and here also version bump, like that's included. Like no, we don't do that. Like that's part of the deployment. It's not part of the feature that is being added. So we have the version number and the build number. The version number is also called the marketing number, which is the one that's visible to the end user, and then with the build number, which is just an incrementing number. So you can very easily automate it. You have to update your Xcode project to like enable automatic versioning, and then you can use this tool called AGV tool, which does everything for you. You just call that, or if you use Fastlane, you can use the increment build number and increment version number, CLI, which uses the AGV tool under the hood. So raise your hand here in this room. Who of you ever had to manually generate screenshots for the App Store? Almost everyone. Like, do we think that as iOS developers, it's our job, like, to do that manually and click through the app? It's not a fun process, obviously. It takes a lot of time. And the crazy piece about it is that every time you change the design of your app, or every time you add a new language, or every time there's a new device, you have to take the screenshots over and over again. And the screenshots are actually very, very important for conversion on the App Store, right? And getting the screenshots right is really, really hard. It's, you want to make sure the content is perfect. You want to make sure everything is aligned. And then as you took new screenshots, you've noticed that you did something wrong. You have to go back, and so on. So I do want to encourage people to automate it. Fastlane Snapshot is one of the tools. There might be others out there by now. But it's a very simple tool that you could also like write yourself, basically. It's just iterating over all the languages and all the devices you want to support, and then triggers a UI test. And so UI test is written in Swift Objective-C, and it basically tells your app how, like it tells a snapshot how to navigate in your app and where to take the screenshots. And it would then take these screenshots and like store them in a folder, name them properly, and you can upload them straight to like App Store Connect. And similarly to the build machine, you want to have disposable simulators. So on every run, we actually, like, you're obviously in control, but you can like clean the simulators or reset the simulator and make sure that you do the whole flow again. And as mentioned before, like the upload works straight out of the box. And because we just had an accessibility talk before this one, this is great for accessibility. And why? It's because UI tests use accessibility labels and accessibility identifiers to navigate in your app. So that means you are forced to add accessibility support to the main flows of your application. So this might be a really good way to convince your manager and be like, hey, we should invest in accessibility because it allows us to automate the screenshots. And then one last benefit is finding overlapping buttons and like layout bugs in different languages. So as you create like all these screenshots, you have these, let's say 10 screenshots for each language and each device. So you end up with this huge thing, and you can just scroll through it. And so my native language is German, so the cancel button is called Abbrechen, which literally takes up half the space. It breaks almost all the apps. So with stuff like that, you can very easily find those. Now to my favorite topic, and basically my job title now is code signing. So code signing itself is unfortunately still not a solved problem, which is kind of a bummer, because the fact that we code sign for App Store builds is pretty useless. Like the code signing itself for App Store builds, we could just get rid of it and it would be just as safe. So the reason being is that code signing is a way to verify that you as a developer built and signed this application, you upload it to App Store Connect, Apple goes through the review, and then re-signs your app and then publishes to the people, to the end users. So it's basically a way to verify that the app didn't get modified and that you as a developer did this. But Apple re-signs your app anyway, meaning that the only path you need to protect is from your local machine to Apple. And we could use something like just basic two-factor verification and achieve the same results. Anyway, I filed a radar, it's not fixed yet. But until then, we still have to do code signing ourselves. And so one of the main issues for larger team is how do you synchronize private keys? If you want to be able to deploy from multiple machines, how do you do that? And how do big companies like Google or Facebook do it? Well, most of these companies actually build their own thing. You can use something like fast in match, which also describes how you can do it yourself, like if you want to be in control, or you can just use that. One really funny thing is that fast in match uses Git by default to like store your private keys. And obviously a lot of developers are like, well, that's kind of weird. I mean, even though it's encrypted, like another layer of encryption, it's still kind of weird to use Git. And so we actually have a lot of people and companies say like, oh, we cannot use that. Like, our security team doesn't say it's secure. And so I would ask them, oh, what do you do instead? Like, what do you come up with? Like, well, we send each other emails. So it goes without saying, like, don't send private keys via emails. You can use Git, or you can use Google Cloud, like key storage, and like there's some ways to do that. I do recommend spending some time on this. If you're a larger team, like don't waste time like syncing keys manually. And the last minute of this talk, I want to very briefly also talk about the future of like some of the workflow improvements. So basically, I want to encourage like all of you to like also spend some time and like feel enabled to be able to like build something new or improve something existing. A lot of the innovation in the iOS developer community came from the community itself, not necessarily from Apple. It's stuff like CocoaPods and so on. And so one thing I do believe we should focus on also is containers. And again, it's mostly Apple's fault that we don't have that yet, but we should find ways to like achieve similar results in a similar environment to get to a level of professionalism that other developers already are at. So I know there's some innovation going on. Companies like Uber are heavily investing in like building stuff that allows us to do that, but there's nothing out there yet, and especially nothing out there that's open source and like distributed. We're going to have more public APIs over the next few years. So Apple noticed that, oh, people use Fastlane, but why? And so they looked into it, and they realized if a company like Facebook says, oh, we want to deploy new app updates, and Apple says, oh, yeah, just use this Xcode button and like click Build and Archive and like upload to App Store Connect. Companies like Facebook don't like that, so they need to automate it. So luckily, Apple reacted to that. And they actually provided the first set of APIs, and as we know Apple, they always start small, and they add more and more stuff over the next few years. So I'm really excited to see the new APIs. Apple definitely listened to us when it comes to that, and it's not a coincidence that like all the code samples for the API were all written in Ruby, made it very easy to integrate into Fastlane. I do want to encourage also everyone to like think about text-based configuration files. They're extremely powerful. So what that means is instead of a 10,000-line storyboard that a human cannot read, stuff like the Swift UI, stuff like the Xcode version file, everything that's text-based that a human being can read and a computer can read is extremely powerful. So if you build any kind of tooling internally or publicly as open source project, think about if you can build something that's text-based so that you have it in version control, that you have the history, and that everybody can read it. And finally, more community-driven project. As mentioned before, I do believe that when it comes to the iOS app development processes, a lot of the innovation came from the community. We have Christoph speaking tomorrow about like the app development flow as well, and like a lot of the innovation, if you just look at the other speakers and like all of the attendees here, like a lot of open source projects, a lot of innovation coming there, and we all have the tools to actually do something. And if you look at the JavaScript community, like they actually do a lot of stuff that like they built their own stuff. And I know that we as iOS developers sometimes feel like, oh, Apple has to do it. But Apple is, just one company. Like we all have the tool and the tools and the freedom to build something. So yeah, I hope to see some cool projects from everyone here soon, and thank you for having me.